Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 22 in our course on general psychology. And with this lecture, we're going to begin a new unit, and that unit is on personality. So, personality, as we'll see, is about what makes us individuals, why we do the things we do, and what makes us different from the people around us. So, this unit will consist of two lectures. In this one, we're going to focus on what I call the inner world of personality. So, we'll talk about some theories that deal more with internal mechanisms for personality, those that are internal to the individual. As opposed to next time, we'll talk more about the external world, so how situations affect a person's personality, how external circumstances and other people affect personality. So we'll talk about some more of those inward-looking theories first in this lecture, and then switch gears a little bit for next time. So what we're going to do is look at personality in the next two lectures. We'll focus on two different approaches this time. One is the psychodynamic approach, which was founded by Sigmund Freud, arguably the most famous psychologist in history. And then we'll also look at a slightly different approach, a more modern approach, and frankly a more popular one, and that is the trait-based approach. So in the beginning of theory on personality. The psychodynamic approach was sort of the only game in town. That was the first kind of theory about why people act the way they do. Later on, the trait-based approach was developed, so we'll talk a little bit about history there, but mainly about methods. And for either of these, the question is, how do we measure personality? And there are different approaches to doing that depending on whether you're coming from the psychodynamic school of thought or the trait-based school of thought. So what we're going to do in particular is go to that psychodynamic approach and look at what Freud's ideas were for how the mind works, how behavior works, what the structure of personality is, and what makes people different. We'll also look at that trait-based approach, and there are many such theories, many such structures for personality that use the idea of traits. We'll talk about the most popular ones, and really psychology has settled on one in particular that is really widely used. We'll also look at influences on personality. We'll see that there are biological substrates for a person's personality. And we're also going to look, as always, at the brain and see what the brain has to do with personality. So first, as always, we have to define our terms and ask what personality is. So your book has one definition. I think it's a little too short. I think it's kind of incomplete. So I've borrowed this one from another textbook. And that is that personality consists of psychological qualities that contribute to an individual's enduring and distinctive patterns of feeling, thinking, and behaving. Now, your textbook has that last part, the feeling, thinking, and behaving. That's what we're trying to understand. That's what we're trying to explain. But I think the earlier parts of this definition bring up some important ideas that the definition from your book doesn't really do. So one of these is that idea of contributing to patterns of feeling, thinking, and behaving. So that gives us the idea of a causal relationship. So these are qualities of the mind or the person that have something to do with how that person acts. So the idea that personality causes behavior, certainly early theories of personality thought that was true. As we'll see next time, later theories say, well, maybe the situation the person's in has a lot to do with the way they act as well. So there is a debate as to how much contribution personality makes to eventual behavior, but there is always that idea of a causal relationship. The second part we see here is an individual's enduring patterns of feeling, thinking, and behaving. And that gives us the idea that the personality is in some way consistent. Now, we don't want to go too far with this claim and say that someone's personality can't change, or that it doesn't change over the course of decades. But when we describe someone's personality, we're talking not about their moment-to-moment behavior, we're talking about long-term qualities. something about that person that stays pretty constant over long periods of time. So this idea of consistency is important. And then we see here the distinctive patterns of feeling, thinking, and behaving. And another part of personality is that it differentiates us from other people. We don't talk about personality in the sense of everyone having the same personality. That would kind of defeat the very concept. No, personality is what makes you you. And so the idea of distinctiveness is another important component, I think, in this definition of personality. Now, there are, of course, different approaches to the structure, the theory of personality. We'll talk about two of them this time, and then talk about a couple next time. So we'll sort of split it across the two lectures. One is the psychodynamic approach, and this was put forth by Sigmund Freud and later followers. And the focus here is on the unconscious. Freud's ideas about personality were that they were largely set by mid-childhood, and that a person's behavior was determined by unconscious drives and the need to control those drives. So again, a very internally driven concept of personality. As we'll see, this is not as popular an approach now, but it still was largely influential. And a lot of that reason is that it was the first theory put forth. Freud was probably the most famous and one of the earliest psychologists. And so we'll talk about the psychodynamic approach to personality. There's also the trait-based approach, which we'll talk about today as well. And here the idea is not that the person is a product of unconscious drives and repressed childhood memories, but rather that personality is best thought of as a collection of characteristics or traits. When we get to the trait-based approach, we'll see that whether these exist on a spectrum or whether traits are sort of discrete and unitary, we'll talk about that later. But the trait-based approach is about describing people in terms of characteristics. Next time, I'll get to the humanistic and existential approach. And this is more about the external world. It's about the choices we make. And it's about personal growth. We'll talk about concepts like self-actualization. And so here, the idea is that we have a relationship with the external world, and that it can foster or constrain our motivation, our choices. So we'll come back to individuals like Abraham Maslow that we talked about a few units ago. And the idea here is that people's behavior is driven by the need for personal growth, as long as they're taking care of the basic needs of the physical body and the individual. And then we'll talk about the social and cognitive approach. And this is that approach that really thinks of personality as far more dependent on the situation than previous theories have. So rather than having a consistent personality where your behavior is the same every time in every situation, the idea here is that the situation really drives a lot of our behavior. And so just because a person acts one way in one context doesn't mean they'll act that way in every context. So we'll talk about that next time as well. So we'll start with the psychodynamic approach. And this, of course, started with Sigmund Freud, one of the most famous psychologists in history. Your book, so I've got a picture here of just a photograph. Your book points out that Sigmund Freud is also available in bobblehead form. So I happen to have my own personal copy right here. So that is not something your book made up. But Sigmund Freud is a very famous personage in psychology, and the popularity of his ideas have sort of risen and waned over the decades. So his approach to personality is not as popular as it once was, but we're still going to talk about it because it's interesting, and B, it sort of sets up later approaches to personality. Many approaches to personality were reactions to Freud's theory. And the idea here for Freud is that personality is really driven by the unconscious. So things we don't have access to necessarily, and the mind has components to it, some of which we're aware of, and some of which we're not. Freud's theory is also famous for emphasizing sex. If you ever take a course on personality or look into various personality theorists, one thing you notice is that the theories that each individual comes up with often center around the person's life history. What I mean by that is that Freud um, had a unsatisfying sex life, and so he tended to focus on sexual behavior and sexual urges a lot in his theories. Other theorists that were happy in their sex lives didn't focus so much on sex. Uh, they focused on personal struggles, especially if they had had those struggles when they were children, or they focused on the influence of family, if they had a difficult family life or a large family. So this is just one indicator that when psychologists come up with personality theories, they're often informed to a large degree by their own personal experience. And Freud was very clinically focused. So Freud was very interested in understanding, explaining, and treating mental disorders, particularly things like anxiety. And so, again, a lot of his research and a lot of his theories are based around examinations of people with psychological problems. And this is different from more modern approaches where the emphasis isn't as much on clinical disorders, where it's on uh, the mental function of your average person. And so because he's coming from a clinical background and has a clinical interest, Freud uses what is called the case study approach. And that is that he examines single individuals and writes about them. So this is not a collection of data where he measured multiple people on some quantifiable dimension. Here he writes down transcripts or important comments about sessions with patients. And so from there, from those individual cases, he has a lot of detail. But the question is how rigorous and how objective is it? So that is just the approach that was very common at the time. It's scientific approach to psychology was just starting uh, uh, to be thought of. But Freud's is very subjective and very clinical, as we'll see. So for Freud, the mind has a certain structure. And some of these components you've probably heard of. We mentioned them briefly previously. So there's the id, and this is that unconscious component. It contains things like drives and instincts and urges. And the id is driven by instant gratification. So the need and desire for food or for sex. Also, the id contains aggressive impulses. You also have the superego, which is also unconscious, but the superego, in Freud's conception, contains social norms. It is thought to be the sort of uh, the holder of rules for behavior. This is thought to stem largely from one's parents as a small child. We'll see on the next slide that Freud's emphasis was really on childhood. Freud thought that your personality was pretty much done developing by the time you were 6 years old or so. And so the superego is what you've learned from your parents or those around you about rules for behavior, especially ethical rules. Now, in the middle of this, you have the ego. And the ego has to act as sort of a mediator. So it has to deal with the drives and urges coming from the id, and it often has to rein those in because it's not always appropriate to behave according to what the id wants. It also has to deal with the superego. It's got to deal with these very rigid moral rules. And so the ego is kind of caught in the middle. And it also, of course, is constrained by what's called the reality principle. The ego is the part of the mind that doesn't deal with abstract concepts like, wouldn't it be great if we could adhere to this rule, or we should satisfy this urge now. The ego has to deal with the real world. It is the conscious part of the personality. And so it has to try and satisfy id, superego, and practical concerns. And conflicts between these various components produce what Freud called anxiety. So again, urges and drives can't always be satisfied at the moment, or perhaps not at all. And so the ego and the id can come into conflict. And this produced what Freud called neurotic anxiety. We don't need to get into the details here, but the idea is that you could have anxieties because you had to suppress your urges, and that could produce this conflict and produce anxiety. And anxiety was, for Freud, uh, a negative aspect of personality that the whole point of the personality was that it would try to suppress or get rid of anxiety to the degree that it could. You also have moral anxiety, when the superego has principles that the ego can't accommodate because of other needs. There are also things like reality anxiety, because there are really scary things in the actual world, and so the threat of harm from outside, impending disasters, these cause anxiety for obvious reasons. And again, the way the personality tries to avoid anxiety, in particular anxiety from the id, is with what Freud called defense mechanisms. One of the most famous is repression, where you don't acknowledge the source of the anxiety. And so this is where urges or traumatic events that cause anxiety get repressed. So you're not aware of them. So this is the personality's way of defending itself. So you might have heard of repressed memories. That is the idea here. And of course, the validity of repressed memories has some truth to it, but not all claims of repressed memories have turned out to be true. So this is a difficult part of Freud's theory. There's also what Freud called rationalization. So in this case, when something that causes anxiety occurs, the person tries to rationally explain it so that the anxiety is no longer valid. So a person that lost their job might experience anxiety. They don't know how they're going to make their living. But they might rationalize losing the job by saying, oh, it wasn't a very good job anyway, or I was about to quit in any event. And so some of the negative aspects of that event in one's life get downplayed. So that's another defense mechanism, is explaining away behavior or events uh, in a way that they don't produce anxiety or that there isn't a conflict in the personality. There's also what's called projection. Uh, and this is where you project those negative forms of anxiety on other people, the sources of anxiety. So if you're feeling an aggressive impulse from the id, you will often describe other people as being aggressive or hostile. And so that way, your own aggression is just a product of theirs. So again, that helps explain the urge coming from the id in such a way that it doesn't produce that conflict with the ego, and you get a reduction in anxiety. Now, these are just a couple. There are others, and your book lists them, but we don't need to go into all the defense mechanisms. Uh, they're important in Freud's theory because they are not healthy approaches. So they're sort of short-term fixes for anxiety. You're not addressing the cause of the anxiety. You're just sort of putting off the symptoms. And so repression, rationalization, and projection are three of the most famous, and in Freud's conception, three of the most common. And so I've mentioned them here. So as I mentioned, for Freud, childhood was really the stage at which personality developed and was solidified. So it's important to understand Freud's ideas about development, and he broke development into various stages, which is not unique to Freud. We've talked about developmental stages before, but here for Freud, those stages of development are very much about uh, sexual impulses and about sources of pleasure. So it's very id oriented. So the first stage is what Freud called the oral stage. And here the names of these stages come from what Freud referred to as the erogenous zones. That is, the parts of the body that were the source of pleasure at that stage of development. So in the oral stage, this is when the individual was a baby. And of course, one of the things babies are known for is just eating all the time. That's really all they can do. They can't do much besides eating. They don't have much control over their bodies. And so their source of sustenance, but also the focus of their behavior is the mouth. So that's why Freud called it the oral stage. So there, the source of pleasure is the mouth, and it's about getting what the individual needs. And so uh, we'll talk more about how this development process can go wrong in Freud's conception uh, at the end here. But the oral stage is about feeding. It's about pleasure derived from food or from sensation on the mouth. The next stage was what Freud called the anal stage. And this is the stage in childhood where the individual undergoes toilet training. And so, again, developing a little more control over the body, but also uh, adding a new facet to the relationship with the parents. So the parents here are trying to toilet train the child, and the child can either obey the parents or not. And so if you've ever heard the term anal retentive or just anal in reference to people being very organized. So if they have to have all their possessions in a certain order, or if they like everything to be very clean and tidy, they're often referred to as anal retentive. And this is from Freud's theory of personality. His idea was that in the anal stage, if the person is conflicted about toilet training, that they can defy the parents, and this later translates to being very organized, wanting to have control over things. The next stage was what Freud called the phallic stage. And this is where the erogenous zone shifts to the genitals, and you start to have more complex emotions, certainly more control over the body as well. But here, the child, uh, in Freud's conception, starts to feel sexual desire for the opposite sex parent. This gives us the idea of what's called the Oedipus conflict or the Oedipus complex, where a child has a repressed sexual attraction toward the opposite sex parent and starts resenting the same sex parent, but then eventually resolves the conflict by just identifying with that same sex parent and emulating them or admiring them in some way. Uh, Freud's followers applied this idea to both sexes, both males and females. Freud really applied it mainly to males. Um, Again, that's details. Those are details we don't really need to go into here. But the idea here is that there is an element now of sexual desire um, in the phallic stage, and again, we have the development of more complex emotions. Then, around 5 or 6 years old, the individual enters what Freud called the latency stage. By the way, this image here on the right is a painting of Oedipus, after whom the Oedipus complex is named. Oedipus is uh, a figure from Greek mythology and ended up marrying his mother and killing his father unbeknownst to him. So that's why it's named that. There's this tragic figure in Greek drama named Oedipus who sort of literally lived out what Freud was talking about. So the latency stage is something that starts around 5 or 6 years old, and this is where development kind of stops. All the sexual urges get repressed, and the individual often throws themselves into hobbies, interests, uh, friendships with individuals of the same sex, and so there's not really much development going on here for about 10 years. Uh, Later on, the individual enters what Freud called the genital stage, which is puberty. And to Freud, the person was consistent. Their personality was set at that point. Um, so puberty was the onset of adulthood and the point at which development of personality ceased. Now, there's also in Freud's mind the idea of fixation. This is where you get stuck in one of these earlier stages. So if you've ever heard of someone having an oral fixation, the idea there is that the person is not really developed out of the oral stage of development in Freud's theory. So in the lower right here, we have Humphrey Bogart smoking a cigarette. And to Freud, things like smoking, drinking, excessive eating, these were all signs that the person had not really finished their development from the oral stage. Obviously, they could function as an adult, They still had control over themselves, could express themselves. But something had happened during childhood that caused them to either not get enough to eat or to be unsatisfied with that oral stage in some way. And so they were kind of stuck. And so as an adult, they exhibited behaviors like smoking, eating, mouth-oriented behaviors uh, as a way of demonstrating that oral fixation. They were stuck in that oral stage. And fixation doesn't just happen at the oral stage, it can happen at these other stages as well. And Freud explained hostile and aggressive behaviors as forms of fixation, for example, or really exaggerated versions of the stereotypical behavior for one's sex. So if you acted really macho if you were male, or really feminine if you were female, to Freud, that was suggesting that you were fixated at the phallic stage. So again, all of these behaviors as an adult relate back to developmental stages during childhood. So how did Freud and followers assess personality? Well, there were a couple different assessment methods. I've already mentioned the case study. Freud would obviously take notes about his patients. Freud's also famous for analyzing dreams. And this is another area of psychology that is not as popular now as it was then. Uh, many people think that dreams are just representations of random neural activity in the brain. But to Freud, they were very important. They were sort of a window into the unconscious of the person. And so Freud spent a lot of time analyzing dreams. Later psychodynamic approaches used what's called the Rorschach ink blot test, which you've probably heard of. You've probably seen figures like the one at the bottom here. So these are random ink blots. They are not pictures of anything in particular. But if the patient is presented with a picture like this and they're asked to tell a story or describe what they see in these images, this is what's known as a projective test. So the person is not being faced with a real stimulus. It's not a concrete depiction. So the idea is that whatever they say, however they describe it, says more about their personality and their unconscious than it does about the stimulus itself. A related assessment is what's called the thematic apperception test. And we see an example here in the middle. So these are more representational images. So we can see two people here in this picture. But you don't have a story here. You don't know why these people look the way they do. What's their relationship? What has happened just before the picture that we see here? And so again, we have an ambiguous stimulus, and what the person says about the image is supposed to give us insight into the personality. This is another projective test. The trouble with dream analysis, with ink blot tests, with apperception tests, is that they're highly subjective. So that is to say that how you interpret a person's response depends not just on the patient, but also on the psychologist that's measuring them. And so there are various approaches to interpreting ink blot or apperception tests, and a lot of what a psychologist might say about the patient's personality has as much to do with the psychologist as it does with the patient. So that is a potential problem when it comes to projective tests as assessment methods. Okay, so that is Freud's psychodynamic approach. A later approach is what's called the trait approach. And this was put forth first by an individual named Gordon Allport, who we see here on the right. The idea here is that a trait is, as your book says, a relatively stable disposition to behave in a particular and consistent way. So again, we have this idea of consistency, and we also have that word particular, so distinctive in some way. So everyone doesn't have the same traits. One question with the trait-based approach is whether traits are discrete or continuous. So that is to say, for example, if we have a trait like outgoing, is that a unitary trait? Is there a set of individuals that has the trait of outgoing and other people don't have it? Or should we instead describe people as being outgoing to varying degrees? That everyone has that trait to some degree, And then we have an amount, so that would be continuous. Uh, Alport's approach was more the discrete view, that you, as a person, had a collection of traits that described you. And of course, there are thousands of words that could describe someone's personality. And this is one of the problems that faced the early stages of the trait-based approach. So if you have these discrete terms, or even these continuous ones, how many of these descriptors do we apply to a person? Because there are just so many possible ways to describe somebody. The question there is, how many traits are there? Are there as many traits as there are words to describe people? Probably not. That'd be cumbersome. And so the process, the history of the trait-based approach, a lot of it is about trying to figure out how many traits there are. How many ways do we need to describe someone to really capture their personality? And the trait-based approach often uses a hierarchical structure. So we can see in this diagram from your book that these descriptions are placed in a hierarchy. So at the top, we have the broadest version of the description, neuroticism. And then within that, we can see this has components like anxious, having low self-esteem, being moody, being shy, and we'll get more to neuroticism here soon. But then we get even more specific behaviors. They cry easily. They're quick to anger. So now we're getting to very particular emotional states. They're sensitive to feedback. From there, you can get to individual instances, like the one time a person criticized them and they took it very personally and didn't talk to the person for a long time. So that would be a particular instance. So we can fit all of these things in a hierarchy that eventually describes the person's personality. So as I mentioned, the trait-based approach comes in both discrete and continuous forms. And later trait theorists have really focused on that continuous version. So for example, a psychologist named Hans Eysenck came up with not a giant collection of descriptions, not a lot of personality traits. Really, he said that people were largely defined by, at first, two, but then three. He added a third one. And these three traits were extroversion, so how outgoing a person is, how much they seek social contact with other people. Neuroticism, which is about emotional stability. So how easily upset someone is, how easily they form trust relationships with other people. So are they prone to jealousy or anger based on other people's behavior, or are they calm and more emotionally stable? So that's neuroticism. And then the third is what he called psychoticism. Now we see that in this word, the word psychotic, which now is used to describe people with disorders like schizophrenia. So I think here it was not saying that people are schizophrenic to one degree or another. What he meant by psychoticism is really impulse control. So the degree to which somebody can delay gratification, can control impulses. So I think that's what psychoticism was. Now later, two more trait theorists come along, and they are Robert McCrae and Paul Costa Jr. And they came up with what is often referred to as the Big Five, or the five-factor theory. It's often referred to by the acronym OCEAN, which is a word that has the initials of the five personality traits. And this is probably the most popular personality approach in psychology today. This is a more modern approach. As we'll see, both McCrae and Costa are still alive, which differentiates them from all the theorists we've talked about so far. So we have the OCEAN test, or Big Five, and so it keeps two of Eysenck's measures. They are extroversion and neuroticism, and then expands with three more, which are openness to experience, which is the O in OCEAN, and this is curiosity, how the degree to which someone conforms to existing ideas or tries to seek out new experience or is open to new information coming in. The A is for agreeableness, and this is the degree to which people try to get along with others, how trusting they are. So it describes their social relationships. And then the C in ocean is for conscientiousness. And so if you describe someone as conscientious, it usually means they're disciplined, they're thoughtful, they like to stay on top of the various aspects of their lives. They tend to be a little more organized, and they tend to be diligent. And traits like conscientiousness tend to track well with job performance, for example. Uh, and so these are three new traits that were added to two of Eystink's original ones to compose the Big Five. And again, this is probably the most popular personality survey and measurement technique in psychology today is the Big Five. It seems to be very valid. That is, it seems to actually describe behavior in the real world. It also tends to be very stable. So when you take one of these surveys uh, and then you take it again years later, the results you get tend to be pretty consistent. So it doesn't seem to be as dependent on situation. These do actually seem to describe relatively permanent aspects of a person's personality. Later researchers actually incorporated an element of technology. And so this in the lower right is a utility, a tool they came up with that estimates a person's personality from what they like on Facebook. And it turns out to be fairly accurate. So if you give people this personality questionnaire and then compare this to the model's results saying what your personality should be like based on what you've liked on Facebook, it's pretty accurate. So this is a computer-based model. So it's a more technological approach to personality, but it still depends on the Big Five, on the ocean structure for personality. So when we measure traits, these often depend on self-report. So not projective tests like the psychodynamic theory did. Uh, Here, a person takes a questionnaire or they take a survey, and so they are reporting on themselves. Uh, and this brings up some issues. For example, people may not always be aware of all of their behaviors or personality traits. And so you're filtering your results through whatever they're aware of. There are also demand characteristics. People, again, like to portray themselves in a positive light. We already know this from the beginning of our course. And so there's a tendency to answer questions that make the person seem more pleasant, seem more agreeable, seem more emotionally stable. And so there are problems with self-report measures. But this is in contrast to the case study method. You're not looking at an individual and getting an in-depth review. You're giving personality surveys to a large number of people. When it comes to the brain and personality, particularly with regard to trait theory, personality can, of course, change. They are usually consistent. But trauma to the brain, or disease, or being on a medication, these can all change a person's personality. And that's not surprising. We're changing something about the brain. So we're going to change things about behavior, about emotional response, emotional control. We now know the story of Phineas Gage, who lost part of his prefrontal cortex, and accounts vary in terms of how much his personality changed, but emotional control seems to have been diminished. And so changing the brain certainly can change personality. Going back to Eystink's theory about extroversion, and because the Big Five use extroversion as well, this is true there too. Eystink's idea was that people are extroverted, that is, they seek out social contact, because they have lower levels of arousal naturally in the brain. And so they're kind of trying to supplement the amount of stimulation their brain is getting by seeking external stimulation. And this, to a certain degree, has been borne out by studies looking at cortical arousal, so looking at activity in the brain and looking at the difference between introverts and extroverts. And it does seem to be the case that introverts have more intrinsic activity in the brain. The idea being that they therefore don't seek out as much social contact because they don't need the extra stimulation. In fact, they prefer quiet environments. Also, the trait neuroticism, so emotional stability, uh, seems to be linked to sympathetic activation. So we know the sympathetic nervous system is about arousal. It's about a response to potential danger. And so individuals that are high on neuroticism tend to have higher levels of sympathetic activation. And this makes sense given that neuroticism, part of it is about responding to events in the environment and treating them as threatening. So if you're highly neurotic, uh, you might treat a neutral threat or a neutral stimulus as a threat, whereas an individual low on neuroticism would not treat it as noteworthy. But a neurotic individual treats it as threatening and often has an emotional response to it. And that person also tends to have more sympathetic activation. They tend to be in fight or flight mode more easily. Genetics also has a role to play in personality. And so if you look at the big five, uh, from trait to trait among the five, it varies how heritable, genetically speaking, that trait seems to be. But you average them all together and you get around 40%. So it seems that nearly half of our personality traits depend on our genes. The rest, of course, depend on development and the environment. But there does seem to be a genetic component. You have personality traits that tend to be similar within families, for example, and between identical twins. Even for complex behaviors like political attitudes, there seems to be a genetic component. There's not one gene that determines whether you're conservative or liberal, but there do seem to be groups of genes that influence how receptive you are to new ideas, for example. And so that obviously has a relationship with political or religious attitudes. And so there does seem to be a genetic part to play there as well. And of course, one question is whether animals have personalities. So oftentimes we'll describe our pets as having personalities and describe their personality traits. And there does seem to be some truth to that. That if you ask people to estimate the personality of various animals or pets, that there does seem to be some consistency between the people giving the ratings, but also over time, a given animal will be fairly consistent on that trait. So it's not that they are entirely determined by their environment moment to moment. They do seem to have some sort of internal determinants of their behavior, of their way of thinking and feeling, and they seem to be consistent. This is a figure from a paper on this very topic, where people were asked to rate personalities of hyenas in this case. Uh, and what's interesting is they were being rated on neuroticism. Now, in humans, uh, females tend to be a little higher on neuroticism than males do. In hyenas, the opposite is true. The males were rated as being more neurotic than the females. And the question, of course, is why would this be? Well, of course, in our culture here in the U.S., uh, it is traditionally male dominated, and physically males tend to be bigger. In hyenas, the opposite is true. Females tend to be bigger, and dominance is largely governed by the female line. So females are dominant members of the pack, and dominance, leadership of the group, so to speak, is passed down from mother to daughter. And so, obviously, a very different culture with hyenas. Um, and it's perhaps not surprising we see a switch in the personalities for males and females. And again, this is just an average, um, but maybe there is a component to the physical nature of the two sexes and the way that the groups are organized according to sex. And so maybe that has an influence on personality and the genetics that correspond to personality. Okay, so that will do it for this lecture. Next time, we'll continue looking at personality, and we'll look at the humanistic existential approach. So this is a more outward-facing approach, looking at our existence, how we reconcile life and death. Are we getting to a point in our lives where we can look at personal growth, where we can focus on becoming better people? Another approach is the social cognitive approach. And this approach will focus more on the influence of the environment and the situation. So we'll see a difference between certainly the social cognitive approach and things like psychodynamic theory, which suggests that our personalities are determined in early childhood and don't really depend on the environment. And then we'll wrap up this unit looking at the self. So what is our view of ourselves? How do we define ourselves? How do we describe what's important to us? And how do other people influence our view of ourselves? So we will talk about all of that next time, and I will see you then.